an immense media coverage. So I would venture to say that we may not, in fact, be seeing an increase in vigilante attacks by Muslims, but France is a powder keg. It's an Islamophobic powder keg where anti-Muslim animus has existed in that country for decades, obviously. It's been exacerbated by recent policy. It's been intensified by the war on terror. It's been intensified by the rhetoric we're seeing from Macron. So when an actor who is Muslim engages in deviant activity, that explodes the powder keg, and we sense as if there's an increase in vigilante violence by Muslims, which in fact may not be the case.
I think that's interesting. I mean, it certainly echoes, I think, with what a lot of the Muslim community feel. That when somebody is from a Muslim background, it's immediately something that's wall-to-wall media coverage. We saw this week that there were 2 attacks against Muslims in France, against Muslim women, and very few people heard about that. I think that's a very valid point. If I can come over to you, Sister Samira, Khalid referred to the fact that this is not about recent history, but this is something that's been going on for a while. The Arab and Muslim presence in France is something that does go back a while, and the historical problems go back a long way as well. Do you think that what we're seeing now is a consequence of those historical issues, or is it something more contemporary that we're witnessing that we haven't quite got a handle on yet?
Assalamu alaikum. I would say that it's having a lot more to do with the fact that in France they don't teach about the Arab and Muslim presence in this country for a long time. That's the first problem. And they consider that the Arabs and the Muslims are kind of patches having appeared after colonization, which is absolutely wrong, because the Arabs were first in France, in southern France, long before Christianity, and second, because the Muslims were present in France ever since the first Asia, the first century of Islam. This is the first point. The second point is that they always talk about immigration and the problem of culture and religious identity. And yet they fail to teach students about the identity of a part of the French citizens who from very ancient ancestors are French, Arab, and Muslims. And the other point also is that they avoid to speak about the Arabic presence in the French language. They avoid to speak about the Arab toponymy of several cities in France, like Marseille, which is in fact Marsa, referring to the port of Allah, or to Ain, which is in fact referring to a sort of source water, or Ramatuel, who is in fact a reference to Rahmatullah. So I think that it's a lot having to do with the absence of information regarding these historical elements about the French history.
Okay. If I could bring that to Sheikh Haytham, I mean, what our sister says is that there's a general sort of ignorance within France about how established these communities are, how long they've been around in France. It's not a new thing. I mean, what are your thoughts about the wider issues of the Muslims within Europe, Muslims within France, and the lack of knowledge by the, for want of a better word, the indigenous communities, the European communities, about how long our culture and our relationship has already been in existence?
Yeah, if I may say, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salam ala Rasulillah. I think Europe in general is facing a number of challenges here. Yeah. Regarding the presence of Islam and Muslims in Europe. European countries have not yet digested that Muslims became part of the mosaic of Europe. And see, there is a deep question here, which is, once we say Europe, Professor Khalid, you are a professor, and I think, let me ask everyone, once we say Europe, what do we mean by Europe? This is a very deep philosophical question. What do we mean by Europe? Do we mean geography? Do we mean people? Do we mean background, culture, religion? Because whatever you say, apart from geography, everything fails to define Europe. That's why there is, I can say, Macron said that there is a crisis, Islam is facing a crisis. I think there are a number of challenges that might become even a crisis within Europe, which is the identity. What is the European identity? And because there is a crisis regarding the definition of we as European, who are we? Yeah, apart from geography, history, Europe doesn't have homogeneous history. Culture, different cultures. Language, of course, 20-something languages. Ethnicities, how many ethnicities? Religion, even religion. You know that so many historically Christian countries, they denounce Christianity and they want it to be identified as atheist countries. One of them is, for example, the Czech Republic. So what is Europe once we say? So there is a deep question here. And as a result of this, Europe is unable to digest the new presence of Muslims and accepting them to be part of new Europe. And this is one thing. On the other hand, if I may say, this conflict between the Islam, okay, and the non-Islamic Europe, let us put it like this. If we say that there is a conflict, and it is not an outcome of one reason. It is an outcome of a number of reasons: historical, cultural, ideological, political, maybe economical reasons. So that's why the problem is a bit sophisticated. And just to make it simple, Europe has to accept that there is a new presence of those Muslims, and they are part and parcel of the European landscape, and we have to accept them as Muslims. And those Muslims are Europeans now, because Europe doesn't have an identity unless there are some thinkers and politicians who want to define Europe as everything but Islamic. Or let us say like this: there are the right wing and unfortunately number of politicians who want to define Europe as an anti-Islamic continent.
So if I can bring that to you, Professor Ramadan, those comments. Were you able to hear us now, Professor Ramadan? Okay, we're just going to wait for your. Just if you can give us 1 second, we're just waiting for your sound to be patched through. If you could try that again, Professor Ramadan. Okay, so we're still having. I do apologise. We're still having a slight problem with your audio. I believe we are joined now by Dr. Sheikh Yasser Qadhi, who is joining us from the United States. Sheikh Yasser, are you there? Can you hear us? So we're just. As we always have these days when we're trying to use multiple platforms, and we're using Skype, we're using telephone links, we're using all sorts of things.
Because the our Prime Minister, announced yesterday the new lockdown. So the internet has been locked down, or responding to those measures.
We're just going to go back to Professor Ramadan. Professor Ramadan, are you able to hear us? Okay, well, you can clearly hear us, and we're still struggling to hear you. We will come back to you shortly, inshallah. I'm going to come back to you, Khalid, on the issue of identity. Right. Okay, yes, you came loud and clear all of a sudden. Professor Ramadan, if I can just reflect that back to you, this idea that Europe themselves haven't settled on what their identity is, on any kind of definition of identity, and we see this very clearly exploited by right-wing groups where they talk about the sort of the threat to the white identity of Europe, and that's often levelled against the increasing Muslim populations that they see. When we hear Sheikh Haytham talking about that, when it pertains to France, how pertinent is that to France? The idea that they haven't really defined what their identity is, and certainly haven't defined where Islam and their fourth, fifth generation Muslims who are in France, where they fit within that French identity.
Yes, Bismillah again. So sorry for that. I heard the three inputs here, and I think it's very important when it comes to define, as Sheikh Haytham was saying, about the European identity. And I think that there is something which is necessary that we are missing in the whole story. Two things. The first one is the historical background. What Samira was just saying is so important. Why? Because history is not only about our presence in Europe, it's about our Islamic contribution. There is no European culture without the Islamic input because of the very old Muslim presence in Europe. There is no Europe, so to say, no European identity without the philosophical, ideological, even philosophical and religious input and contribution by Muslims. And we have to get this. The problem with many European Muslims is they don't even know about the story. They don't even know about the history of their presence. This is one. The second dimension is exactly what Sheikh Haytham was saying right now, is that when it comes to define the European identity and the European presence, there is, they are asking us to integrate. You Muslims, you have to integrate. The problem is not about us integrating, it's about the Europeans and the French to integrate the Muslim presence as Islam is a French religion today, and it's a European religion. So the narrative, this is what I call the new we, and to speak about the new European narrative by putting Islam as part of it. And this is something which is difficult to digest, that as it was said, but more importantly is to speak about this new reality. And yes, we are now reaching the fifth generation of Muslim. And let me tell you something. We have to stop repeating what the French or some Muslims are saying about the fact that integration is not working. The Muslims are disenfranchised, only disenfranchised in France. This is not true. In fact, this is the far-right rhetoric about the Muslim presence in France. That's wrong. That's wrong. In fact, integration is working. Of course, we have social problems. Of course, there are suburbs. Of course, they are trying to, ghettoize the Muslims. But if you look now, after 4 generations of Muslim presence, now they are everywhere. They are medical doctors. They are in universities. They are journalists. They are more visible. And this is why now we are facing the crisis. The crisis is not because they are ghettoized. The crisis is because now they are getting out of the ghetto, the social ghettos they were put, and their fathers and mothers were put during the 1st generation. This is the other way around. It's the fact that social integration has worked, and they thought that after 4 or 5 generations, Muslims and Islam will just disappear. And this is the opposite. The more educated they are, the more practicing they are. And this is this was not expected. That's the reality of it. And this is why we have this new rhetoric about the visible Muslim presence today. And this is the challenge that we have now.
I think that's an extremely interesting perspective, and I'd like to look at that perspective from somebody's experience on the ground. I have an anonymous sister who's joining us now from France. She didn't want to be identified because she's feeling the tension about speaking out about these issues. She wants to speak particularly about the issue of being a Muslim woman in France. If we can just patch through to our sister in France. Assalamu alaikum, my sister. Are you able to hear me?
Yeah, I hear you very well.
Wa alaikum salam. Thank you very much for joining us. It'd be very interesting for us, for our viewers and for our panelists to hear what is the experience of being a Muslim woman on the streets day to day, living in France at the moment in the current situation. What sort of issues are you having to deal with? How integrated do you feel in the French project?
Well, as you may know, right now we are under lockdown. And I think it's not that bad right now because of what happened. Every time a terrorist attack happens, sorry, I cannot hear myself really well.
Carry on, sister. We can hear you.
Okay, so I was saying, whenever terrorist attack happens, we are kind of scared because of what the government could say and what will happen afterward. So first of all, we're scared because of the terrorist attack itself. We could be there, and also because we know that a wave of racism would just come after. And as we saw earlier, Muslim women are the target because they are easily seen, and so it's kind of scary for us to go in the streets. and we are expecting the government to protect us because we voted for them for this as French citizens. But what we can see is that it has not been done properly. When you think about wearing a beanie because you don't want to be stabbed, it means that there is something wrong. We are scared because we turn to our government. We have the feeling that they see us as the problem. So how can we wait from them to protect us when we are mainly afraid of what they will say, making it worse? And that's exactly what happened last time. This time, terrorist attack happened, and what did the government? They sent police to search into mosques, Muslim schools, Muslims association, and even halal meat certifiers. So they are trying to dissolve them. And this can only make us think that for the government, French Muslims and terrorists are related in a sense. And because you hear that, and you hear that there were terrorist attacks, and just after it you see the government taking measures against French Muslims, what would you think? You would think that French Muslims are the cause of terrorist attack, of course. So after a terrorist attack, of course we will be scared.
So it seems very clear to me. And may I ask my sister, are you second generation, third generation, fourth generation, in terms of how long you yourself have been in France, how long you've been a French citizen? Did you hear that question? I'll just repeat the question. My sister, you yourself, how long have you and your family been in France? Are you first, second, third generation of French citizen?
My parents are the ones who came here,
Right.
and I was born in France and I grew up here.
So it's very interesting to hear that as somebody who was born in France, you grew up in France, that's your home, you still feel a sense that when the government are talking about Islam, it's a kind of us and them. They're not there protecting you when they talk about being protected from terrorism, being protected from these attacks, but they seem to be maligning you with the problem rather than somebody who needs to be protected from the problem.
Yeah, exactly. And that's very sad because, as you said, we were born here, so we are French. And when we think about home, we think about France, but we don't feel home at home. And so we have kind of an identity crisis. And when we hear you and us, we don't know. We're French, but we're also Muslim. Can't we be both?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's an extremely pertinent point, and it's a pertinent point for us to just leave it there. Thank you very much for joining us. We're going to be coming back to all of this, to all of our guests in just a few minutes. We're going to a very short break. If I could just ask you all to hold on in your respective places, because I think we've had some extremely interesting recent things on, recent comments on identity. We'll see you in just 5. Assalamu alaikum and welcome back to The Review, where we discuss the topic of the day. Today we're talking about the ongoing situation in France, and we've just actually been speaking to a sister who herself was talking about the difficulty in marrying up the identity between being French and being Muslim. Now, we tried earlier to speak with our Dr. Sheikh Yasir Qadhi, live from the United States, where he's travelling at the moment. We're going to try and go back to him. Assalamu alaikum, Sheikh Yasir.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah. Hope you can hear me now.
We can hear you loud and clear. Jazakallah khair. Thank you very much for joining us. I wanted to come to you just to reflect on what our sister was saying. She was talking about the difficulty of marrying up those two identities. She's a second generation French citizen, born in France. French is her first language. It's her home. It's her country. But yet she said that she's often made to feel that she's part of the problem, where she herself feels that she needs protection from the problems that we've seen. The sort of inexcusable vigilante acts that we've seen in recent days, she feels as much of a victim of that as anybody else. Sheikh Yasir, when it comes to this conflict in identity, how much of that is the responsibility and duty of the state, and how much of that is the responsibility and the duty of us as a Muslim community to try and bring some cohesion between those two aspects of our identity?
That's a really good question. And I think in terms of France, we need to be very clear here and understand that this notion of laïcité is actually something that the French are weaponizing against the Muslims. the trope that we're being sold is that laïcité is inherently French. But if you look at it historically, the concept of laïcité was regurgitated from history textbooks in the late 80s and early 90s, specifically in the context of young ladies wearing hijab. And the notion of somehow the French identity being threatened by religiosity was not something that was rampant throughout French culture and French history. Yes, true, there is a notion called laïcité from 100 years ago. But this weaponization and stigmatization of an entire group is something that is unprecedented even in French history. And that is why to this day, generally speaking, French nuns and, French Jewish people, they're able to live, with maybe not the same freedoms as America, but definitely not with the same antagonism as is being shown towards the Muslim demographics. And therefore, we cannot buy this simplistic notion that the French identity is somehow different than all of Europe and all of America. That having been said, there's no doubt that there's also responsibility on the Muslims of every Western land, France included, to demonstrate that they are a part and parcel of their societies. I believe that that has already been demonstrated by and large by the millions of peaceful Muslims living all over the Western lands. So there's no need to put more of an onus on them than is on other groups. I think that is unfair. So right now we have a power differential. We have a government on the one side and we have a disenfranchised minority on the other. You cannot expect the government to act like a bully, to provoke, to incite, to claim that an entire demographics within their own country is not worthy of its citizenship unless it lives up to values that other minorities are not being asked to live up to. So even if there is an act of vigilante justice, even if one of our own does something that is illegal or unethical, that does not give the right to a state apparatus to resort to a schoolyard bully and to act in a very, very unwise and foolish manner. And in fact, it is very clear that that these actions are stemming from a blatant hatred of the faith and of the religion of a large group of French citizens, and Allah knows best.
So you're implying a sort of malevolence and a deliberate policy there to not look at the best of the Muslim communities. I mean, Professor Ramadan was saying earlier that actually the integration of Muslims is much more successful within wider society than many people would anticipate. And I could see you nodding there, Professor Khalid. Just coming back to what Sheikh Yasser was saying, what are your comments on that?
Well, the first comment I'd make is, look, France prides itself on being a liberal republic, a liberal democracy, and the very foundation of any liberal democracy is freedom of conscience, right? It's the ability of the citizen to practice whatever faith or non-faith they see fit. So when we're talking about integration or assimilation, the real integration that has to happen is that the French state has to integrate to its pinnacle, its cornerstone value, which is freedom of conscience, or else say that is something we're not going to extend to every citizen, and specifically Muslims. And that's exactly what's happening in France. It's critical to understand two things. The first thing is that France is home to the largest Muslim population in Western Europe. Roughly 8 to 10 million Muslims call France home. Second, these Muslims are indigenous. Like Professor Ramadan said earlier, Islam is not a foreign faith. It's a faith that's been practiced on French land for many decades and many centuries before these new diasporas came to France. So I think what's going on in Sheikh Qadi makes a great point, is that laïcité, which was weaponized in the 90s, was exclusively directed at the Muslim population, right? We had this enshrinement of secularism, which was not directed at Jews, it was not directed at Christians, it was not directed at Buddhists or Hindus. It was mutated into a weapon to bludgeon the Muslim population because we had French politicians as early as the 80s, and then obviously climaxed after the War on Terror, that we were engaged in this clash of civilizations where Muslims were bent on taking over France. So laïcité became a weapon to undermine and derail that process of Muslims becoming part of the French polity.
If I can come to you, Sister Samira, you've heard the comments. Is this something that echoes your experience in the research that you've done, that it's a deliberate sort of weaponization and an intentional attempt to marginalize the Muslim community as opposed to other religious denominations when it comes to their understanding of secularism and the French ideal? Is this something that you've witnessed in your research?
Yes. And I would like, before answering your question, add another historical point, which is referring, in fact, to the name of Europe itself. I have written a dictionary of Muslim names and worked also on the name Europe, which comes from Aruba, who is the daughter of King Agenor from Syria. And Europa, Europe means Arab.
Oh.
Thus, when the Europeans say that they are Europeans, they say without knowing it that they are Arabs. This is the first point.
That's a really interesting point. Yeah, thank you for that.
Yeah.
If I could, come back to the question.
And as for the second question,
Doctor,
yes,
don't antagonize them more, please.
Sorry, I can't hear you.
Don't antagonize them more.
Well, let's say that personally I have always studied in a Catholic school. It has always been a great experience as a pupil, except in historical lessons. When it was about history, the teachers were always aggressing me. I felt aggressed because I was the only Muslim pupil in the classroom. They were aggressing the Black African Muslims or the Arab and Muslim civilization as a whole. And I once, when I was 12 years old, I had to stand up and tell the teacher that she was lying and leave the classroom because she had in fact gathered three classrooms and started to project slides about Black Africans and speaking about them in a very despicable way. I didn't appreciate it, even though I was very young. So this is the reason why I stood up and told her, "You are lying," and then I left. And at the same time, I was starting to learn through other manuals of history, another point of view, another vision of history. And this is somehow what helped me to respond with scientific arguments to the future attacks. And when you say about, when you speak about this problem that we have today in France, it refers directly to the history. As long as we do not put on the table the very genuine history of France with the Arab contribution, the Arab and Muslim contribution, we'll keep on facing with the same problems, and it will probably get worse. And this is something that has to be highlighted. And I believe that it's high time to separate the teaching of history from politics. Just like in the past they have separated the state from the church, they have to do it at this level as well. And otherwise it will keep on going worse.
I think that point you just made there about separating history from politics is really interesting. I'd like to come to Sheikh Haytham in a moment about that. I'm going to come to Professor Ramadan on that point. I mean, the word that we haven't heard so far is colonialism and the French legacy and their history. How much of an issue of the problems that we're seeing at the moment, with whether you want to call it the identity problems of the Muslims or the identity problem of the French and how they understand Islam, how much of this is tied up with French history rather than it being an Islamic issue?
Yes, I think you are right, and this is the essential question. And I may disagree with what Yasser Qadi said about the fact that we have to look at laicity as only weaponized today. I think that this is not exactly true when you come back to history. When you come back to history and you come back to the colonial time, you understand that laicity, the way it was used, for example, in Algeria, was in fact not implemented in Algeria. Why? In order to control the Muslims. Remember that Sheikh Ibn Badiz asked the French government, we want you to implement laicity in Algeria in order for us to be free from the state control, the French control. Understanding that the true laicity meant separating the control and the government control, the French control on the Muslim Imma and the Muslim community. So it's a very old discussion, and get it right. This discussion started with the Jews and the Protestants in the French landscape, and then it came to the Muslims. So today, yes, is a political tool, but to do what? To disenfranchise the Muslims? Not only. In fact, it's a way to control them. It's a way to control. It's a kind of a new religion to control the French Muslims. So you cannot understand what is happening in France today if you don't get a sense of the colonial time and colonial history. And that's the point. But let me be clear on this, because you have to be quite cautious in the way you look at France. And for example, Professor Baidoun had been, very much involved in Islamophobia, and I think all what he's saying about what is happening in the United States of America and what we are saying about what is happening in Europe, we have to get it. That today the problem is not only about, using laicity against Muslims in France, or France is worse than the other countries. I'm sorry to tell you, what we are facing in France is exactly what we are facing in Europe, and what we have been facing in the United States of America is who is Muslim and how do you define this. So our first struggle here, it's about semantic. It's about defining words. It's about what do you mean when you talk about political Islam or Islamism or radicalized Muslims? What do you mean? If, for example, I am a Muslim citizen now facing power and telling to my country, telling to my government in France or in Switzerland or in the United States of America, I'm a free citizen and I want to my rights to speak out, to speak the truth to your country by saying what you are doing, for example, not only in my country but everywhere around the world, that this is wrong. Am I an Islamist or am I a free Muslim citizen? So we have to come back to this, because if you isolate France for all what is happening around Europe, because now it's the time where the far-right parties are normalizing their discourse and the pattern. Not only them, by the way. So I would say here that instead of thinking that France is in crisis, we have to look at the West as it is. Today we are facing something which is completely new. In the name of controlling Muslims, let's talk about political Islam and Islamists, and you don't know who you are talking about. Who are these people who are talking about? Are we talking about the violent people, or are we talking about the people who are aware of their rights in the country or in the land? And I think that if we don't come to this, the first duty of Muslims, instead of complaining about the fact that they are rejected, is to come and to say, now we want clear definitions of the words you are using. When you say what is a citizen, what it means to be a Muslim, and my identity is to be a European Muslim, a French Muslim, a British Muslim, an American Muslim, and there is no contradiction. This is one. Second, if you want to condemn violence, we are the first to condemn violence. But if you condemn violence, we condemn all the violences around the world, not only the people who are resisting, but the people you and my country is killing. So let us be clear on this, that it has to be quite clear, because if you don't come to a clear way of dealing with definitions, at the end of the day, what we are facing today, we don't know who we are talking about. You know what the French president was saying yesterday or the day before yesterday? He's saying, radicalized Muslims are the literalists. So who are you talking about? Who are these literalists you are talking about? Are you talking about the Saudi reference or the Saudi ideology? Who are you talking about? We don't know who they are talking about. So I think that this is very important that we come, let me put it that way, take France as an example, historical and current example of what is happening around the world, and not only saying that France is Islamophobic and not get it to get the right picture, which is now the Western challenge for the Muslims, and the Western Muslims are facing a challenge that is a common challenge. Yeah. Who are you? How do you talk about yourself and what is your objective in these countries.
Thank you. And I'd like to bring Sheikh Haytham in on what Professor Ramadan was saying.
Professor Tariq, Jazakallah khair, I think is a very valid point. Let me just maybe take it one step further. I think it is a global problem rather than a European problem. Yeah, because if you look around the world, you will find that, you will see that Muslims, for example, in Uyghur Muslims in China, there are indigenous Muslims in China. Why China or the Chinese government is targeting them? Same thing with the Burmese. Same thing if you look around the world. So what is the real problem? I think the real problem is that, the whole world, they know that Islam is the only religion that can resist being controlled. Yeah? And now there is an international movement all over the globe is to that the elites in every single country to control the inhabitants of that country and to pass whatever policies they want on each country. They know that the only people who can resist that are Muslims. This is politically, but let me go back to it on an ideological perspective. On ideological perspective, it is very simple. We Muslims believe that the power lies with Allah. Yeah, so we will not accept that the power, we will not accept to be in a traditional classical maybe language to be enslaved by human beings.
But that very concept creates a problem often in the minds of the Europeans when they say, well, you're citizens of a European country now, you're citizens of a Western country, and our law is sovereign. Our law is sovereign, and you are citizens of this state.
This is, that's why the problem is a deep problem, whether in Europe or in China or elsewhere. Because we Muslims, we say that the sovereignty belongs to Allah in the first place. This is one. And we are the only people who will stand against injustice to the last minute. Yeah? Everywhere in the world. We are the only people who will stand for certain family values, for example. Why everyone is resisting or is maybe fighting us regarding some basic family values, and they are trying to impose certain family values on the entire world. Look at the entire world. We are the only people who are resisting this dominance, even in this simple thing, which is family values. So there is a real problem here. Yeah, if we let us not simplify the problem. Now, with Europe, they have to, at the end of the day, they have to see, in fact, the whole world, they have to see that Islam is the fastest growing religion. And Islam, maybe after the fall of the Ottoman Empire in 1924, now Islam is on rise. So you cannot deal with Islam as when the Ottoman Empire was in decline and then it was finished. You cannot deal with Islam like this. We have to, the world globally have to find a new formula how to deal with Islam and Muslims. The old mentality wouldn't work. And let us talk about our European countries. Our European countries have to find that formula, have to accept that formula, otherwise there will be real clash of civilizations.
Coming back to the original question I posed, and if I can go back to Dr. Yasser, Sheikh Yasser, on this issue of this clash, how much of the responsibility falls at the feet of the Muslim communities to reach outside their bubble, and understand the paradigm, understand the context and the perspective of non-Muslims, many of whom are not malevolent, many of whom are very innocent, but they are being fed a kind of narrative through politics or media about who Muslims are. How much of that responsibility to give a counter narrative is ours, and how much of that needs to come from the media, from journalism, and from the state?
Well, before I answer that question, I need to comment on this notion of clash of civilization. Of course, Samuel Huntington proposed this notion of clash of civilization in the early 90s. And historically speaking, if you look at that term, again, there is no doubt that it has been used to actually exacerbate this so-called clash of civilization. Therefore, it is a self-serving term that has actually been used by the far right and by the more militant wings of our regimes and our governments to provoke a clash of civilization. Frankly, if you ask me, it is quite apparent that instead of a clash of civilization, what we are seeing is a clash within Western civilization regarding the future of Western civilization. The real clash is within, because we as a minority, especially in America, we are less than 1%. We cannot actually provoke a clash of civilization from within. But what we're seeing, and which is manifested very slightly in the left and the right, and the Democrats and the Republicans, and overall the notion of where Islam fits in, it really is about the character of Europe and the character of the Western world. You know, how tolerant is it going to be of faiths and ideologies that perhaps were not, you know, historically as mainstream as others. Yes, they were there in token forms, but not, not to the percentage of other faith communities. So that's the first point. The second point, if you remember Bernard Lewis, again back in the late after the 9/11 attacks, he wrote that infamous article, Muslim rage, why the Arab and the Muslim world is so angry.
Yeah.
And once again, we can flip that entire article around, and we can point out that what appears to be the case is that there is a visceral anger, a rage, maybe even a type of jealousy of Europe with regards to the religiosity and the faithfulness of Muslims. Because again, no matter how politically incorrect this is to state, but the truth is that Islam as a faith is alive and well. The average Muslim is still a believer in the tenets of the faith.
Yeah.
The same cannot be said of the average Christian or of any other faith community.
Yeah.
And therefore, another reality that we need to take into account is that this xenophobia, this Islamophobia, is actually a mechanism of finding an identity of Europe. We are becoming the other, against which Europe is able to define itself, because define its own understandings. Uniformity doesn't exist within Europe. By creating us, they can find something in common. I hope that makes sense.
It does indeed, and it echoes actually what Sheikh Haytham was saying earlier. Well, thank you to all of our guests. If you could just stay with us, we're going to a very short break. When we come back, I'd like to kind of go to one of the fundamental issues that's at the core of what's happening in France at the moment, and that's the concept of freedom of speech, and whether that freedom of speech is being equally distributed amongst communities in the way it's being perceived. See you in just a few minutes. Welcome back to our lively debate here on The Review. We've been discussing some of the recent problems in France and actually looking at the wider context of the Muslim identity within the West in general. I'd like to come back to something that's really at the key of what we've been seeing in France. Again, we've been seeing these inexcusable vigilante attacks in France, often perpetrated in the name so-called of Islam, which are clearly inexcusable and nothing to do with our faith. They've been sparked by this supposed offence to the Prophet Muhammad, may peace and blessings be upon him, which was then raised to a whole new level by the French state in the name of freedom of speech, this secular value that they have, that you should be able to say whatever you want. What I'd like to do is to look at that concept of freedom of speech and look at the way it's being interpreted, the way it's being manipulated, the way it's being used. And if I could start with our anonymous sister who we still have on the phone. Sister in France, are you still there with us on the phone?
Yes, I'm with you.
What I'd like to ask you is clearly the French state have said, look, freedom of speech is paramount. We should be able to criticise whoever we want, whenever we want, no matter what the tension, no matter what the sensibilities are. You, as a Muslim French citizen, do you feel the right to be able to criticise the state? Do you feel the right and the strength to be able to stand up as a Muslim woman and say, I'm really unhappy about this, I don't like what's going on? Or do you fear that when you put your head above the pulpit, when you put your head up, that you will be then labelled as an extremist or an Islamist?
Yeah, exactly. There is definitely a double standard here. So something very important in France is freedom of speech. And we Muslims never said that we were against it. And in fact, for example, if we take the example of Charlie Hebdo, before 2015, no one cared about what they were saying because we were just not reading them. We didn't see them. So when the attack happened, we were the first one who were super shocked. Who would do that for drawings, even if they are super bad, because we just don't look at them. So again, we were asked to justify what happened, making us feel like we were the enemy again. And so this is freedom of speech. So, but when Muslims are the ones who want to talk, it is not accepted. For me, for example, just wearing my hijab, it's freedom of speech.
Yeah.
But I'm not allowed to. I was wearing hijab when I was in middle school, and I had to remove it, even when I was 22, for my education. So for me, this is a freedom of speech, but if I try to explain that for me this is important, I am seen as an extremist, an Islamist, everything was it. So even this word, Islamist, I think it shouldn't be used. It shouldn't be used when we talk about terrorist attacks, because of course people would just make a shortcut between a terrorist attack and Islam, and it is way too easy. So we see here that if we follow Islam, it's okay, but if we add the Ist at the end, it's too much. So what people understand here is if we follow Islam a little bit, it's okay, but if we go too far, if we consume Islam too much, then it's bad. And that's why I think this word shouldn't be used at all for terrorist attacks. And I want the freedom of speech to be for everyone, Muslim, not Muslim, all the same. And what we can see here in France, it's a huge double standard. Even if we say that the drawings are super offensive for us, Muslims, the Prophet ﷺ, what we talk about is, no, we need freedom of speech. Okay, but then give it to everyone, to Muslims as well. Whenever we want to raise our problems, we are told that we're extremists. And we can see that after this attack, the government tried to dissolve the CCIS, which is a collective of lawyers that helps Muslims against Islamophobia. And we need them today more than ever, but the government tried to dissolve them. So it means that for the government, Muslims that are attacked or shamed, it's okay. And we're not allowed to talk, and associations are not allowed to talk when they're Muslim, and they are trying to close the collective that is helping us against Islamophobia.
So I think thank you very much. I think your perspective is clear, that you feel it isn't being fairly used, this concept of freedom of speech. It is used to offend, as it has been, the Muslim population, and clearly that's been done with the... I don't know whether it's certainly intentional, but it's been done saying that there is a higher purpose here, that freedom of speech is more important than anything else. But when you as a Muslim citizen in France feel that you want to speak out, you feel that that freedom isn't equally applied to you. What do you think about what our sister said about this concept, Professor Khalid, about freedom of speech?
Yeah, well, she highlights the very lucid reality of selective application of free speech in France, right? So I'm somebody who teaches constitutional law in the state, so I'm somebody who values and truly emphasizes the importance of free speech. And I think magazines, institutions, individuals should have the right to say and publish what they want to say. But with one point, so I want to address this question from two angles. It's an important distinction to make that free speech that incites violence should be regulated by the state. And what Charlie Hebdo was publishing, and she makes an important point to say that Charlie Hebdo was an irrelevant magazine that nobody was reading before 2015. So Charlie Hebdo made an intentional capitalistic decision to publish inflammatory graphics and content on Muslims because they did that to sell magazines, right? It was an economic move. Yeah. So by virtue of being antagonistic and inflammatory towards Muslims, they're selling magazines. And they're inciting violence, they're inciting discrimination against a population in France, which is extremely vulnerable, right? Which is experiencing and enduring violence as a consequence of what they're publishing. The state knows this, Right? President Macron knows this, and when speech devolves into violence, that's when the state should step in.
Yeah.
Now, on the other angle, when we talk about free speech and selective application that is not being extended to Muslims, the sister makes an incredibly important point. It's critical to understand that freedom of conscience, the ability to exercise whatever religion you want to exercise, is tied to freedom of speech. So wearing a kufi, wearing the hijab, that is an expression that is tantamount to verbal in speech, essentially. So if Muslims are being qualified as treasonous or subversive or radicals or suspicious on account of freely exercising their faith, or even not even engaging in critical discussion of the state, not engaging in dissent, that kind of behavior is being conflated with terrorism. Let me give you a quick example. A couple of days ago, and this got no media coverage, there were siblings, Jordanian siblings outside of Paris, who were simply speaking Arabic. They were simply speaking their mother tongue, their native language, near the subway, and they were attacked by vigilantes, right? These were white vigilantes attacking these poor students because they spoke Arabic. They were accosted as a consequence of them freely exercising their speech, which again rendered them targets of hate crimes. This got no coverage, and this is not the kind of speech that is being protected or honored by the state. So we're seeing here a real discrepancy and a real contradiction with how free speech is allocated and assigned largely on lines of religious and racial identity in France.
Okay, I think most international conventions, whether it's the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights, whether it's the European Court of Human Rights, when they talk about free speech, it isn't something that is absolute and undefined. It comes with certain rights, certain responsibilities. If I could come back to you,
not only that, everywhere in the world there is no absolute freedom of speech.
Exactly.
Even in France recently, now it is a criminal offense to burn the French flag or to degrade the French flag or the French symbols. I think they added to that. So even themselves, they admit that there is no absolute freedom of speech.
It's not unconditional. If I can come back to you, Samira, this idea that in this case, freedom of speech is the most important thing, and there's this terrifying minority within France who have to be kept in their place by the use of freedom of speech, no matter how offensive it is, no matter how inflammatory it is. What are your thoughts on that?
I would personally say that it has nothing to do with freedom of expression. They know exactly what they are doing. In fact, their problem is that in the future, the Muslims will be the majority on the European continent. So as they cannot stop this demographic development or evolution, they are trying to prepare generation or future generations while breaking their personalities. They are working on destabilizing them. And this work is given to professors of history who are working as weapons or tools in order to fulfill the objective of the politics. I mean, it's because when you take a look at what happened last week at Avignon, when it was made by a non-Muslim, they spoke about him as an unbalanced. A crazy man or whatever. Whenever it is a crazy or unbalanced Muslim, or so-called Muslim, or a crime that is a Muslim is accused of, they say that this is terrorism. I mean, I'm quite sure that they are aware of what they are saying and the words they are using, and this is how we can also highlight that this semantic is very important. They know what they are doing, and it has absolutely nothing to do with the freedom of expression, and this is how I'm seeing things, personally.
Professor Ramadan, when we listen to the comments we've been talking about freedom of speech, Do you feel, as our sister alluded to there, that actually it's more that it's being used as a political pawn? As a political pawn, it's what we call dog whistle politics. That we're actually saying we're standing up to defend this fundamental right of freedom of speech, but actually what it's doing is it's just picking out a very easily identifiable minority who are relatively powerless within the system in order to make political gain for those statesmen of those politicians.
Yes, I think Samira is completely right. It has nothing to do with freedom of speech and freedom of conscience. It's deeper than that. In fact, what we said about laïcité, the way they are using this to make it a weapon against Muslims today as it was yesterday and to transform the whole understanding, it's exactly what they are doing with freedom of speech. Let me tell you something. You know, I'm born in Europe, in Geneva, and my second language is the French language. And France, it's the only country where I was not allowed to talk in one university in 25 years. And you talk about freedom of expression. My story, what is happening today, all this controversy around me, is to target me just to make me disappear from the political, intellectual landscape in the country. It is all about this. So if they don't want you to talk, they are ready to do whatever to make you disappear. And I said this to many Muslim leaders. I will be the first, you will be the second. And look at what is happening now with Muslim organizations. And in the name of freedom, now we are closing closing mosques and Muslim organizations because they are doing what? They are, charity organizations, or they are organizations working to defend the Muslims in the country, what the sisters said right now. So this is where we have to be quite clear on three things, if I may, quite quickly. The first one, as I said, if we are not clear enough, because before that you are asking us about our responsibility as Muslims and as Muslim citizens. And I think it's very important now to put ourselves in the center of the political, intellectual, cultural discussion in Europe. We are Europeans and we are Westerners, and there is something called Western Islam. Western Islam means the same universal principles as to Islam. Islam is not going to change. There is only one Islam, but many cultures, and we deal with all the cultures. We don't have a problem with cultures, and we don't want, in the name of cultures, to change our fundamental principles. So now we have to put ourselves in the center, and from that center to come with a clear terminology. Who are we talking? What name? And when we speak about Islam, when we speak about jihad, when we speak about politics, we have to make it clear. Don't let the people define the words they are using by telling you who you are and how you have to speak out. Now, for example, Islamism itself, we have to be quite clear about the definition. What do we mean by this? So we have to work on this. These definitions should be ours, and we have to put ourselves at the center of the intellectual discussion in the West, not only as fighting Islamophobia, but promoting universal common values that are also ours. This is one. The second here, very quickly, that is important in our discussion here, as I said, when it comes to the context, we need to understand the context and to understand what they are trying to do when it comes to, freedom of expression and freedom of conscience. Now, we were told for years, you have to abide by the law of the country. And what we have been saying for years, we abide by the law of the country. You know what they are doing now? They are changing the law of the country to make it more restrictive towards Muslims. That's what is happening. It happened with the Patriot Act. It happened now. Now, the discussion in France? The discussion in France is we have to have a stronger legal apparatus in order to control the Muslims. And we have to make it clear, if we are the first target, the whole society will pay the price of this. This is exactly what they are paving the way to control all the citizens. So if we are putting ourselves outside the political arena and the political spectrum in the West, we are wrong. So we have to stop saying Muslims versus non-Muslims. Even these words, I'm not using them. I'm not even talking about non-Muslims. I'm talking about my fellow citizens and people of other faiths. Let us come together because we are the first target. We will be the second. And let me be clear on this, because what Sheikh Haytham was saying when he said, you know, we are the only people able to do this. Unfortunately, we should be the only, but we are not the only one. Unfortunately, the Muslims are not doing the job today. We have to do it much more, but we have to be clear on our objectives. At the end of the day, we, Western Muslims, what do we want? What do we want to achieve? Are we here to convert all the people and to impose Islam onto people? This is not what we are doing. This is not what we want. We are here to serve the people. And when it is said, وعباد الرحمن الذين يمشون على الأرض هونا وإذا خاطبهم الجاهلون قالوا سلام. There are three things that we don't want. We are here to serving the most merciful. By doing this, refusing arrogance. الذين يمشون على الأرض هونا, meaning we are full of humility and we are here to do what? To say to the ignorant. And the second thing that we are refusing is al-jahl. Al-jahl is ignorance. And ignorance here is not only not knowing, is refusing to deal with the reality of the world, and the reality of the world is multiple identities, multiple religions, and common destiny. The thing that we are here to do is to spread peace. And to spread peace means we will never stop serving the people by asking for justice for all. We are here for that. It's our way. It's towards justice. Our mean. It's towards peace, and our means is about justice. I think we have to be quite clear on this and understanding now that they don't want us to talk, because if we say this, it could be that people are going to listen to us. It could be that people would say, oh, they are here to serve, not to oppose. Well, they are here to promote, not to destroy.
I would like to bring in Sheikh Yasser on that idea, on the idea of the Muslim community's role in serving the wider community from our values, from the West, but also, if you'd like to comment on that, but also coming back to the original question about freedom of speech. You spoke very passionately recently in one of your sermons, Sheikh Yasser, about the idea of freedom of speech being a minority prerogative to speak out to power, and not as it's being manipulated at the moment by the state using it to control a minority. What are your thoughts on that?
Yes, precisely. So the issue of freedom of speech is really not what is at stake over here, because what is happening is the selective usage of that freedom in order to insult only one demographic. I think we Muslims need to be very cognizant of the legal and the social concept of freedom of speech. From my side, I am not asking for any special laws. From my side, especially in America, we are not going to get any special laws. We have the First Amendment. Everybody has the right to say something derogatory. The question is society going to allow that right to be unconditional? And society has policed itself. In order to be civil, it must do so. Therefore, if a person of a white background uses the derogatory slur beginning with the letter N for African Americans, there is a heavy, heavy penalty to pay. Nobody says there should be ultimate freedom of speech. If a Christian uses anti-Semitic tropes or very derogatory language, which has happened in the last few years a number of times, there is a heavy social penalty to play. Nobody's going to go to jail. The government's not going to fine you. Nonetheless, society is not going to allow you to get away with being so uncivil, so undignified, so much incitement towards hatred and stereotyping. However, when it comes to the Muslim community, societies are embracing the right to revel in inciting hatred. That's where the double standard comes. So I think Muslims should not fall prey to this canard of the freedom of speech. Yes, there is the freedom to say what you want. And if an individual artist does so, well then, I understand that they might have the legal freedom to do so. But for the government to get involved, which is what is happening in France, for the president himself, for the media, for society to jump on board, no one can deny that there is a clear double standard taking place. That is to answer your first question about the issue of freedom of speech. The second question, again, what Muslims are doing in Western lands, I think, again, what Dr. Ramadan is saying is something, this is a question we all need to ask ourselves. What is the goal of Western Islam? What is the goal of us living here in the West? And again, I have given many khutbahs and lectures. For me, it is very clear, لِتَكُونُوا شُهَدَاءَ عَلَى النَّاسِ, that you are going to be witnesses unto mankind. Our goal is to embody the values of our faith for others to see. Whether they choose to accept or reject, it is up to them. As Allah says, إِنَّمَا عَلَيْكَ الْبَلَاغُ وَعَلَيْنَا الْحِسَابُ. Your job is to convey, our job is to judge, Allah says. So we are not here to force people to convert. As Allah says, أَفَأَنْتَ تُكْرِهُ النَّاسَ حَتَّى يَكُونُوا مُؤْمِنِينَ. Are you going to force people until they are believers? That is not our job. But it is our job to embody our values and to demonstrate what it means to be faithful people in a faithless world. People who stand up for truth, for tawheed, for justice, for equality, for all of the values of the Abrahamic religion. And that is something that, inshallah, we will continue to do until the day that we die.
Thank you very much. I mean, Sheikh Haytham, you alluded to some of that same that Sheikh Yasser was just talking about. And so, just coming back to you, you were saying that freedom of speech is clearly not unconditional. It's clearly used in different ways. But again, I'd like you to comment on that. And again, on the other subject that Professor Ramadan brought up about our role here, about the importance of the Muslim prerogative to serve and to be here to serve the wider community.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Well, I totally agree with what Professor Tariq have said and what Sheikh Yasser have said. But let me just go one step further by saying that, see, the problem is, look, there was a meeting between some thinkers in 19-something. They were discussing the Tablighi Jama'at. Yeah, and I think it was okay. I just forgot actually which city, but they were discussing the Tablighi Jama'ah. We know, okay, for fact that the Tablighi Jama'ah were or is apolitical. Yeah, they don't engage themselves in any political discussion, and they just want to serve people, and they are very humble, etc., etc. However, they were heavily attacked. Why? Because they say, well, they are just a stepping stone towards what? Making people more Islamic, and then eventually those Islamic people who will be going to the masajid, they will become even politicized by other groups. So even if the problem is really a deep problem. If we just serve people, like the organizations that were shut closed in France recently, Professor Tariq knows. What do they do? Do they do any political activities? No. They are just serving people, charities. So why did they target them? What they have to do with these freedom of speech or the killing or the cartoons, etc., etc. The mosques that were closed, the Grand Mosque, actually, the Grand Mosque that was closed, or one of them, he is actually criticized by Muslims that they are what, as they say, sellout. So at the end of the day, there is a real problem that we as Muslims, as we believe that the sovereignty belongs to Allah Jalla wa Ala. And that is a real problem, not only for the West, but actually for all those who do not submit to Allah Jalla wa Ala. This will be a problem. And therefore, what I am saying, let us not simplify or oversimplify the problem. The problem is there, and let us not brush it under the carpet. What do we need to do? Forget about what they need to do. What we need to do. We need to be, first of all, as Muslims, we need to be more united. We need also to adopt a very intellectual language. We need also to reach to different elements of each society, because definitely in each society there are wise people who we can talk to, and then they can understand what we want. Also, we need to be ready for intellectual debates nationally, internationally as well. We also need to be strong. Because now they said that the French government or the French president yesterday he had an interview with Al Jazeera where he tried in a very diplomatic way to say that he was misunderstood. why is he doing this? Yeah, why he's retracting his position, and now there are many analysts. They say, is he retracting his position? And today he said, well, actually, Islam contributed towards the French civilization. Yeah, so he changed his tune. Why? Because of this international boycott. Yeah, and when he saw that. Even Muslim countries, the politicians within Muslim countries, in the beginning, apart from Erdogan, no one said anything. But when they saw the masses are moving and they are united on this front, then the Muslim leaders, they started to speak. And as a result of this, the French maybe elite have or the parliament have told Macron, we don't need these problems. Yeah, as a politician, you should not be saying something like this. So he started to retract his position. So once we are, aware and politically savvy and active, I think we can have, a positive contribution. And I do agree with what Professor Tariq said, that we need to be engaged. We need to be in the center of the political, social, cultural, intellectual debate in Europe. And to be honest with you, just to summarize, I am very optimistic about the Muslims in Europe and elsewhere, because they are waking up. I was in Denmark. Just let me say that quickly.
Let me interrupt you. I'll tell you why. Because this is something I'd like to summarise on, and from all, I guess, as we come towards the end, which is where are we heading and what do we need to do to bring this together? Because look, all of us want the same thing. As a Muslim community, we want the same thing. We're not going anywhere. We've been in the West for generations now. We want to make this work. We know that we are positive contributors to Western society, and we know that Islam brings the very best to Western society. Our values of charity, our family values, our values of respect, our values of all our Islamic values are something that any society wants within it. And for some reason, we see this constant manipulation that Muslims are a problem. So what I'd like to do is come around to all of my guests finally, and if I could limit it to a couple of minutes each, because there are 6 of you all together. Okay. Where are we going from here? What is the way forward, Professor Khalid? Because we started off talking about the French situation, but what's become very clear in our discussion is that this is a Western Muslim situation. It's much wider than the French situation. We're seeing it in the States, we're seeing it in Western Europe, we're seeing it wherever Muslims are minorities within the West. And I'm glad that there's a positive feeling in the studio. No doubt we have some issues to deal with. What is it that we need to focus on? What is the direction for us in our communities?
So we have to accept the fact, and in the prevailing landscape, that Islamophobia is one of the final bastions of acceptable bigotry. Like Sheikh Yasser said, there's repercussions if you engage in anti-black racism. There's consequences if you engage in anti-Semitism. There's going to be punishment if you engage in a different form of homophobia, for instance, right? However, Islamophobia stands as that final form of bigotry where not only are you going to get an excuse, but you might actually get political reward. And that's exactly what Emmanuel Macron is doing, right? He's revving up his Islamophobic rhetoric in order to essentially increase his chances of getting reelected. The second point is we have to, as a broader Muslim population, globally speaking, is to sort of deny this fiction, deny this misnomer that we're not integrating. Right? Statistics demonstrate that we are, in fact, integrating at very high rates, high clips across the West. Whether it's in the United States, you see Muslims matriculating into positions as professors, academics, journalists, physicians, echoing everything Professor Ramadan said earlier. That's the case for France, that's the case for Britain, and through much of Western Europe. The third and final point I'll make is this, is that as a broader Muslim milieu across the world, we have to begin debating and engaging in the debate with our own terms, right? Rejecting these Orientalists, these long-standing Orientalist and Islamophobic concepts like Islamist, like the clash of civilizations. There is no clash of civilizations, right? The Muslim population is by no means a monolith. It's deeply heterogeneous along a myriad of lines, whether it's ethnicity, race, class, nation state, right? And I think that us as Western Muslims in the West, we can be the vanguard for that movement, right? We can be the intellectual engine, right, to reframe the debate, reframe the argument, introduce new concepts, and deny all these fictions that these states, because what we're engaged in right now is a rise of global populism, which is weaponizing Islamophobia as its primary tool. We see this in France, we see this in the United States, India, China, and the globe throughout, right? But it's our role as Western Muslims to serve as the intellectual vanguard and the intellectual compass, if you will, to reframe the debate in ways that deny these fictions that have existed for far too long.
Thank you. If I could bring that to you, Sister Samira, the same question in terms of what is it that we need to do as a community, and for my remaining panelists as well, the question of where we do have issues of extremism within our communities, and I know you were saying that sometimes, obviously, the media project that as a much bigger issue. But we cannot deny that this has been an issue for some of our communities. There are young people who are easily misled. There are young people who go off and do extreme acts in the name of Islam. We all know that this is not excused by Islam. It's not accepted in Islam. It's not justified by Islam anyway. But do we have a role in combating those narratives as well within our own communities?
Certainly. I believe that we have to work at this level on giving scientific arguments to our young generations in order to respond peacefully and scientifically to the attacks. And we have to highlight that our religion, it has enlightened Europe just like it has enlightened the whole world. But in order for the young generations to listen, there has to be put in place scientific teaching of history and no more an ideological one. And in order to reject at the same time this neo-colonialism that is taking place in Europe and no more in foreign countries.
Well, that was. Thank you very much for keeping that straight to the point. Dr. Ramadan, if I can come to you on that.
Look, I agree very much with what Khalid and Samira just said, so I won't repeat this. I just would add two things following your question. Is really when it comes to ourselves, it's important to get the sense that we need internal critical discussion among Muslims. It's important to have this discussion. You know, unity is not uniformity. And within Islam, if you look at our tradition, the madhahib and the traditions, there is a diversity of, the great scholars were great for two reasons. First, because they were great scholars on their own, and they were great scholars by respecting other great scholars. So that this diversity is the starting point of everything in Islam. One Islam and many scholars with their different schools. And there is a need here for a critical discussion, even the discussion that we can have now with Sheikh Haytham when it comes to, al-hakimiyya lillah, and when you are saying that we are following. Yes, that's very true, that our relationship to Allah, what does it mean when it comes to living in the West? So that the fact that we abide by the law doesn't mean that we are forgetting the principles, and we have to have this discussion even with, Salafi trends, literalist, more reformist, more Sufi groups. This is missing among ourselves, that we need this critical discussion, and we have to be clear that we have some of our young brothers and sisters understanding Islam in the wrong way and thinking that we can kill people. We cannot deny that this is happening. So let us be clear, and let us also be clear about the fact that we are not naive, that we know that some of them are instrumentalized, infiltrated, and pushed to do so for other reasons. So we have also to know about history. It's not new that some are pushed to be violent. So these critical discussion, as Khalid said, you need to start a critical and intellectual discussion within the West on our own terms. Now it's not for you to speak for us. It's for us to speak for ourselves as Muslims and to come back. I'm sorry, you will never, ever, I will accept anybody to tell me jihad should be removed from your lexicon or your terminology. I will come back to jihad, define jihad, and say what it means to be a mujahid when it comes to fighting injustice, fighting poverty, fighting the bad, and refusing the bad. This is a term that is central to the very understanding of what Sharia is and what Islam is, not as holy war, but as resistance and reform for the good in our society. So we have to do this. So we have to come, and we have enough intellectuals and scholars today in the West able to do the job, able to come to this discussion and to make it clear that we are refusing the semantic colonialism, intellectual colonialism, historical colonialism. This is to be refused. So we have to do this in our society. And once again, 30 years ago, I wrote a book saying, لِتَكُونُ شُهَدَاءَ عَلَى النَّاسِ, and saying the global world now is where the Muslims should bear witness to their message before mankind. This is what we have to do now. After 30 years and repeating as Muslims now in our societies, it's very important not only to be accepted. I don't care about being accepted by my fellow citizens. I want to be respected, and first of all, I want to respect myself. And first of all, I understand that respecting myself, it's for me to please God and to be consistent with my principles. Having said that, it means that we have to be a movement of thought in the West promoting humanity and humanism, promoting justice and equality, and promoting justice for everyone. So I would be quite clear on this. I'm very scared of the new trend that we have within the Muslim communities in the West, wanted to be accepted by the West and ready to be silent about what is happening around the world when it comes to the oppressed people, Muslims or people of other faiths.
Right.
If I understand something about Islam, it's if when you have a voice, be the voice for the voiceless. Be the voice for the oppressed. Be the one who is ready to speak out. So it's not acceptable for me today just to be accepted as a Muslim, to be quiet about what is happening in Egypt, what is happening in Palestine, what is happening even in some, dictatorship. Even now, some of our brothers are in jail in Saudi Arabia, and they are as moderate as you, and we are silent. And these are the people who are dealing with Macron when we are silent. I'm sorry. If this is the future of Western Muslims, to be silent, to be accepted, it means that we are betraying our principles. That's not going to work.
Thank you very much for that. Dr. Yasser, if I can come to you, just being conscious of time, we have a couple of minutes for each of our final contributors. Dr. Yasser.
So obviously, firstly, we do have responsibility to correct the misunderstandings and the extremism that is prevalent in a very small group. At the same time, the government, us, to act as the government unto ourselves. We cannot be policing. We cannot be spying on our own. And the government cannot criminalize mainstream Muslim beliefs. So the government itself has the onus of responsibility, but of course, as a cleric, as a sheikh, as a person of knowledge, all of us have a responsibility to correct misunderstandings and extremist ideologies. It just needs to be put into perspective with regards to the responsibilities of the government versus the responsibilities of the individual. With regards to what Muslims need to do at an individual level, I think that these types of situations that we are seeing can actually act as catalysts to the iman of the average Muslim. Alhamdulillah, we are seeing that because of these types of Islamophobic attacks, because of this type of rhetoric, many mainstream Muslims, many non-practicing Muslims are actually rediscovering their faith, becoming more pious and religious. And I think that's a positive step. But more than that, more than just the rituals, more than just Islamic identity, each one of us has a role to play in giving back to society and showing a visible presence of Islam. If we all did this at our individual levels, inshallah ta'ala, we would do an amazing job.
Thank you very much. I think that's such a key point there, that each of us has that individual responsibility. And I remember many years ago when I first discovered and started practicing Islam, the concept that each of us and the way we conduct ourselves and the way we behave is a reflection of Islam potentially to people who don't know much about Muslims. And that can be often the most pertinent and the most powerful way of communicating what the real Islam is to our non-Muslim friends and family. If I can come to our anonymous sister before finishing with you, Sheikh, if we could have some closing remarks from yourself, sister, you who's living in France day to day, dealing with the issues that we're seeing over there.
Yeah, I really wanted to focus on two main things for me: media and also our community and what we could do.
That's great. Sorry to interrupt, sister. That's fine, and we want to hear that. I am just conscious of time. If you could keep it down to a couple of minutes, I'd be extremely grateful.
Yeah, I'll try to be quick.
Thank you.
I wanted just to say what happened right now is that two hijabi were stabbed in Paris in front of their kids.
Yeah.
Two siblings were attacked because speaking Arabic. A store put on his door that no hijabi were allowed inside, and the manager was so proud of himself that he put it on social media.
Wow.
A journalist said on national TV that hijab is the uniform of the enemies of France, and that is broadcasted, and that Islamophobia is a right. So this shows how media are super important. And now we have just protesters in Nice of people saying that we are home, Islam out of Europe, and no one is telling them anything. So this shows how media put a double standard on us. And I think that for our side, we Muslims, we should really focus on our youth and knowledge, because we will never stress that enough. We need to focus on them by showing them the path. The masjid are going to offer free classes to help us at school, giving them gifts when they get honors at their A level. So we don't have time to focus on something else. We have to show them that there is a future, that they will be able to work, and by doing so, they will make it easier for the others. So we really want to show our youth that there is a future, and that, inshallah, we can go through this.
Very, very important. Thank you very much. So I'm going to come to you for some closing comments, Sheikh Haytham. I mean, look, we started off talking about those inexcusable, reprehensible attacks that we've seen, so-called in the name of Islam, something we all reject absolutely. But we've gone to talk about so many different things. We've talked about the identity of Muslims in the West. We've talked about the role of governments in that. We've talked about freedom of speech. It's been all-encompassing. But coming back to that final point, what do we do now? What is our responsibility as a Muslim community? Because there are issues that we have to deal with as well. We can't just say everything is somebody else's point.
Yeah.
What do we do, and what is our role?
Yeah. Okay. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. First of all, let us go to our role model. The Prophet ﷺ, when he was living in Mecca, what did he do? Yeah, and let us extract from that. The Prophet ﷺ was active on all fronts, socially, politically, financially, on all fronts. But I would like to highlight one important point. When the Prophet ﷺ was active, for example, socially, he was not detaching this or divorcing this from Tawheed. So whenever we are active, and I do agree with Professor Tariq Ramadan, but I would like to add one more thing. When we are fighting injustice and speaking against oppression, etc., etc., we need to link that to Tawheed, because otherwise we are not serving the community. They might say, well, yeah, we agree with you, and then full stop. Yeah, this is very important. That's why Allah Jalla wa Ala says in the Quran, وَعَدَ اللَّهُ الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا مِنكُمْ وَعَمِلُوا الصَّالِحَاتِ لَيَسْتَخْلِفَنَّهُمْ فِي الْأَرْضِ كَمَا اسْتَخْلَفَ الَّذِينَ مِنْ قَبْلِهِمْ. Allah promised those who believed, and they did the righteous deeds. So first of all, they believed. Yeah. So, and the essence of our presence is Tawheed. This is one thing. The other thing is we need to try to build institutions as much as we can. Financial institutions, maybe political institutions. I do agree with the sister. Very good, a very important point. Media. Yeah? And alhamdulillah, now why I am very positive. Look, 20 years ago we did not have Islam channel. Now we have 5, 6, maybe 7 media, 7 TV channels, which is good. I would like Muslims to be even more active on social media and to have different media platforms. This is very important. Again, financial institutions. Alhamdulillah, now we have so many Islamic windows in many banks, and we have also an Islamic bank, and and we want to increase that as well. At the end of the day, Allah Jalla wa Ala says, وَإِن تَصْبِرُوا وَتَتَّقُوا لَا يَضُرُّكُمْ كَيْدُهُمْ شَيْئًا. I would like to encourage the young people to become intellectuals, not only to go to engineering, dentistry. No, we would like them to go to politics, law, history, those social sciences, because then they will be at the center of the debate and they will be true influentials.
Wow. Well, look, thank you very much to all of our guests. Thank you to Professor Khalid, to Sister Samira, to Professor Ramadan, to Sheikh Yasser, to our anonymous sister, and of course to Sheikh Haytham. It has been, I wouldn't say exhaustive, but it's certainly been a comprehensive debate. It's taken us in lots of different directions, and I think we're going to be coming back to some of these subjects. So look, thank you very much for joining us. We're going to be back very shortly with another episode, a new topic on the review. And until then, we greet you all good night. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.